Good morning. Thank you for joining us on Wednesday. Everyone have a good night last night? Everyone hit all those parties? This gentleman's got 2 cups of coffee, so he knows what morning it's going to be. My name is Raj Advani. I am a director of product management here at Salesforce. I've been here for almost 14 years. The bulk of that time I've spent with probably a lot of individuals like yourselves, customers, helping them get past their challenges with Salesforce. I spent a lot of time in services before moving to product management. My esteemed co-host here is Rohit Mehta. He's also a director in product management, and he's the brains behind the operation. He's going to give you a great demo. I just like to talk and make stuff up, but he will back up everything I say. So before we get started, and I haven't even given you the session name yet, I just realized that. I'll do that in a second. But before we get started, Rohit and I are quite the optimists. So do not make any purchasing decisions based upon what we say is going to be available. Make your decisions based on what's available now. Who here has seen this slide? Okay, so today we're going to talk about modern tooling for sales, for sandboxes. And before we get into that, I want to give you a primer of what we've been doing the last few years to get to this level. Is anyone here a Dreamforce rookie? Okay, great. So this message will really resonate. A lot of you folks have probably seen a lot of what we're going to talk about for the first few slides. But about 3 years ago, we went through this major transformation on how we want developers to develop applications on our platform. And we came out with a whole set of new tools under the name of Salesforce DX. Turns out that name was confusing a little people, so we don't use it as much anymore. But the tools are still there and very valuable. And I want to just talk about what we've done. We've essentially taken the source of truth out of the org and moved it into source control. If I was to describe what we've done in the last 3 years in one sentence, that's what it would be. So we're now giving the developers to work in the Salesforce platform the same way you work in Java or NPM or somewhere else, where everything is stored in source control and you push to environments. And so that's what we've spent the last few years doing. And because of that, we feel now you've got the ability to do a modern ALM within the Salesforce platform. We've opened it up for not just what I call our hardcore code developers, but I like to call them citizen developers or declarative developers. Who here would fall into that bucket of being not a Apex or Visual Force developer, but I wouldn't say you're an admin either. You do far more than just admin activities. Great. So this applies as well to citizen developers as it does to our Apex developers. We've also added tools to make it much easier to do CI and CD. We know during this transformation, we did make the platform more complex. And we wanted to take the burden of testing off of you and make it easier to your automated testing. So we'll cover all of those things in the next few minutes. And finally, we've made this a little bit more scriptable, more open, and more prescriptive. And that's what we've spent the last few years doing. And now we just want to tie it all together. So this is what I call our ALM wheel. The inner wheel is probably something very similar that most of you have seen or used before on how you want to build an application. You'll go plan code, merge and test to UAT release, and so on. What I've done also here is showed you all those little pieces that we've been building for the last few years and how they map up to this wheel. So if we're looking at plan and code, we've got our Salesforce CLI, which is something that we're really proud of, and the fact that now you can script a lot of these interactions that you want to do. You can now create a scratch org off of the CLI instead of having to do everything via UI, so it becomes far more scriptable. If you want to get into heavy-duty code, we've got this the VS extension for Salesforce, so now you can work. We know a lot of developers love to work in Visual Studio. You're able to do that now with Salesforce, and there's some great enhancements there that Rohit will show in the roadmap slide. When we get to merge and test, that's where I get most excited. We've got a host of new development environments between Scratch orgs, DevPro sandboxes. We're going to make a couple of sneak peek announcements that you'll actually hear again in the keynotes today, but Rohit and I don't want to wait for that, so we're going to give you those announcements this morning as well, because if you're going to show up at 8 a.m., we're going to give you something special. So we're going to give you those announcements as well. And then we move on to the second portion of test, which is that CI/CD, and a lot of that is also with these development environments and how you can now spin up Scratch orgs or how you'll be able to clone Sandbox faster. So we'll get to that in a few seconds. And finally, we have our true and trusted full Sandboxes for your UAT and so on. I still feel like when you look out in the marketplace, that's a big differentiator for Salesforce, the fact that we can give you a full production-like environment to do your final testing or your staging or performance work in or anything in. And then we get to unlock packages, which I know there's other sessions around that. We won't cover a lot of packaging today. There's a great session at 3 o'clock that Rohit and I are also speaking at, and we'll cover that too if you want to learn more about packaging. So if you only take one thing from this 40-minute session, is that there are two viable development models at Salesforce. One is not better than the other. One is not taking over for the other. Both are supported. If you were to ask Rohit or myself or anyone on our teams, both of them are considered best practices. It really depends on your situation, what you're trying to get done. And that will lead you down that path. And that session at 3 o'clock will actually give you a little cheat sheet, like a little flow chart to look at, if I meet this box, this box, this box, I should look at packaging. If I meet this box, I should look at org development. But one of the misconceptions from that whole 3 years with Salesforce DX was that you had to move to packaging. Or if you were a quote-unquote Salesforce developer, you had to be in the packaging world. That is not the case. Both are still viable development models. So Sandboxes, we talked about a bit, and I think they're kind of the glue that holds everything together in that ALM. We've got many different flavors of Sandboxes, from Developer Pro, which are metadata-only Sandboxes, all the way up to Partial, which give you partial data, and full Sandboxes. And because of them, you're able to build with trust. The fact that you can get a production-like environment without touching production. You're able to boost your productivity for both your admins and developers, and those citizen developers. And it helps to build innovations out. And what we've done is we've seen how popular the Sandbox product has been. And last year we announced the Lightning Dev Pro Sandbox, and it's still in pilot as of now. And the main difference between a Sandbox, a Dev Pro Sandbox, and a Lightning Dev Pro Sandbox is I clone this in under 7 minutes. It's a metadata-only sandbox, but I can still clone in under 7 minutes. And like I said, we're in pilot, and some of the feedback I've been getting from individuals in the pilot is this is fantastic. All of a sudden, I have teams of developers, and I have to set up one, and then I just clone my dev pros, and things I get new people up and running much faster than I have in the past. I've got other customers that say, I use this as my gold standard sandbox. So I set up one, and then I can just clone off of it. I can make changes there, and if I need to go back to my gold standard, I have it here where I can clone again. And then I've got other customers that use it for CI and CD, because you can script this. Raj, this is great. I don't live in that packaging world. I don't understand Scratch orgs. I feel comfortable in Sandboxes. Now I can clone a sandbox to run a CI and CD test. So this pilot is still continuing. If you have any interest in joining, let Rohit and I know. We'll see what we can do. There are some limited slots still available. But we saw how popular Lightning Dev Pro Sandboxes were. And so with a lot of work, we were able to now bring that feature into a full sandbox. And this is one of the announcements you'll be hearing later. So now you can clone a full sandbox regardless of size and shape in the matter of minutes. I'm going to stop because to me that's a huge deal. I just wanted to let that sink in. So you'll hear a lot more about it. It's the dev keynote, correct?
Yep.
Yeah, you'll hear a lot more about it in the dev keynote. This pilot will be starting next week. We'll have some limited slots available, and we'll be growing this pilot for the next couple of releases. So come talk to us afterwards if you'd like to get in. I can't guarantee you'll get in on day one, but I promise you we'll do everything we can to get everybody in. But the fact that you'll be able to take a full sandbox and set it up and clone it within 7 to 10 minutes, or we're saying within minutes for right now until we go through pilot, but much faster than how you would set up a brand new sandbox. So you still have to take the time to set up that first sandbox, that initial sandbox. But every subsequent clone is going to be extremely fast. Another challenge that I've seen from customers that have come by is, hey, this whole setting up this sandbox, not only does it take me a lot of time to set up my initial sandbox, but I have a bunch of sensitive data, Raj. Then I have to go and scrub all that data. Who here lives in that world where you have to, oh, this is great. Well, not great for you, but it's great feedback. So I live in this world where, Raj, and I have to go back and scrub all this data. So next thing I know, if I need to get a full sandbox, I got to tell my business it's going to take me 2 weeks. It's going to take me a week for the initial setup and then a week to scrub all this data. And that's just not acceptable to my business. So what's going GA for us next month is what we call Salesforce Data Mask. And it's the ability now to tag what data you want in your production org, and then when you refresh or set up a sandbox, that data is anonymized automatically for you. So no more having to do that manual cleanup of data. And that's going GA in actually next month. And it's great also for compliance requirements. I'm sure a lot of the issues you've got with cleaning out data and scrubbing data is due more to compliance requirements than anything else. So I'm really excited about the fact how quickly we were able to get this out into GA. I just want to give a little shout out to VScode. I think it's a great way to, it's a great next step from where we came with the IDE in Eclipse. Who here still uses Eclipse? Are you still, any plans on moving to VScode?
We have.
Okay.
And yeah, if there was anything I would protest, it's like, well, can we get either some of the functionality from Eclipse into what we can do with VS Code, or can we stick with Force.com?
Got it. I think Rohit is going to give you a couple of little tidbits there in the roadmap slide of things that are coming in VS Code as well. I'm not saying we're going to solve all your problems, but I'm saying we hear your problems and we're working on them.
Right. With the VS Code, I found it seemed a little clunky to me. I use something called Development Suite, which is similar engine.
Okay. And what we now get to what I think is the heart of the new developer experience, and that's the Salesforce CLI. Here's where you'll be able to spin up Scratch orgs off of a command. Now, clone a sandbox off of a command. Push your code from source control into that sandbox or into a Scratch org on a command. And because it's in CLI, all of that can be scripted. Run your script, hit a few buttons, go get a coffee, come back, and you have a new environment with the updated code in there ready to go. So that I think is the heart of the new developer experience. I've kind of been skirting around the whole source control versus org of source of truth, and we'll get to that in a second. But all of this is possible because of the new source format. And for those of you who have been working in Salesforce for more than 3 to 4 years, you know what a challenge it was in the old source format. You had that XML file that just stored everything, and it was unreadable, it was unmanageable, and so probably the biggest undertaking for our teams was breaking out that source into a new source format. It's not pretty, it's not, quote unquote sexy to the user, but it's really what makes everything else possible and what took us probably the biggest challenge to do. Another thing that's going into pilot because of the new source format is source tracking in sandboxes. So very similar to what you do in Scratch orgs. I just saw a gentleman clap, which makes me so happy. So similar to what you do in Scratch orgs, where you can now pull out changes when you make them, you can now do the same thing. We're tracking changes that you make in a sandbox, whether it be a Developer Pro sandbox or a full sandbox. So it kind of completes that org development cycle with CLI and with source control, but for sandboxes as well. It's that final missing link that brings sandboxes along to this new developer experience. So you can make changes in your sandbox. We're tracking those changes with the CLI command. Then you can pull out those changes, put them into source control, then push those changes into a different development environment, all done via source control, so that becomes your source of truth. I'm going to turn it over to Rohit in a couple of minutes because, again, like I said, I just love to talk about this stuff, but I know everyone wants to see it in action to make sure to keep me honest. But I'll leave you with this slide, which kind of shows now the updated org development process. So you've still got your Developer Pro sandboxes, or in this case, hopefully Lightning Developer Pro sandboxes, and that's where your developers do their individual work. whatever feature they may be working on or whatever component they may be working on. And then at the end of the day or whenever, they'll do a CLI command and take out all those changes, because we can source track them now, and put them into source control. You can then run a CLI command to spin up or clone another DevPro sandbox, push all those into there, and run a CI and CD test, an automated test on that. Done there, then you can pull that code out again, and you can push it into staging and UAT, and finally into release. So you can see how source control, you're just pushing code back and forth, and now everything is tracked. I'm hoping it makes your lives much easier. And that's the goal of what we're trying to get done. My last slide is, I touched on this for a few minutes. We understand how complex we've made the platform. To get these rich features, we've had to do some of these things. And because of that, we want to be cognizant about the burden of testing. None of this is none of this works if we don't release quality items. And so one of the best practices that we've talked about a lot is to really consider doing more and more automated testing. And with that, we recommend CI and CD. We are tool agnostic, so we'll work with any tool. We're not going to force you down one path or the other. But it's great for identifying bugs early in your system. You can run a CI/CD on every check-in. So you've got a team of 10 developers. If they're doing every check-in, now you can just spin up a Lightning DevPro sandbox, push that code, run your tests, and get results. So you can see how it really helps with finding bugs earlier, and really helps with getting more quality code. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Rohit, and he's going to show you how all these things work in real life.
Thanks, Raj. All right, so I get to show you the cool demo, which is also the riskier part of this session. But thanks for this overview, Raj. So as Raj mentioned, the environment of choice for org development is a sandbox. I know a lot of people have questions around, is it a Scratch org, is it a sandbox? In the session that we have this afternoon, we'll go over all of those myths, and we want to debunk some of those myths, when to use the right environment. But the environment of choice, again, for org development is a sandbox org. Now, developers typically use a developer sandbox, which is a metadata copy of their production org, and that suits your use case perfectly. It also gives you the flexibility, because dev sandboxes have a very low refresh interval, so you can refresh it very often. This may be a familiar UI to a lot of you. As you notice that there is some additional sandbox types which are currently in pilot, which we would be more than happy to include you on. So dev sandbox is where typically your life cycle starts. I have created a few developer sandboxes here previously for this demo. What I also have is I have downloaded and installed VScode editor. Now, VScode editor is not built by Salesforce. It's a Microsoft tool. But what we have built is an extension to the VScode editor that lets you connect with Salesforce orgs. It lets you write Apex, Sockle, and Lightning Web Components in JavaScript. And we built a bunch of cool, rich formatting functionality within this tool that helps you develop with those technologies. The other thing that the VS Code editor has, which I don't know if you've noticed here, is the terminal down below. And that has integrated the Salesforce CLI that Raj mentioned right into the editor. So it brings you the full power of all the Salesforce APIs right in one place. If you've used APIs previously, you might notice that there's metadata API and data APIs, and all these APIs require you to have an extra level of authentication. You have to set it up and then execute your commands. The Salesforce CLI is great because it takes all of those APIs, puts them together in one place, and the formatting is just a much richer experience with the CLI. Now, if you are not comfortable with the CLI, that's totally fine. The VS Code editor has something called the command palette, and you can invoke it via a prompt. And almost all of the commands that are available in CLI are also available in this more descriptive, English-friendly palette. So you can execute all of those commands. You can create a sandbox, for example. You can open up a sandbox in the Salesforce UI. You can pull and push source between your local workstation and the org, all without ever learning the CLI. You can also right-click on some of those classes and files that I have on the left-hand side and invoke all of those operations very easily. If you do happen to be one of those people who loves getting hands-on with the CLI, then you have this terminal down below tucked very conveniently so that you can start executing commands. Now, one of the commands that we introduced in summer 19 was an operation for creating sandboxes. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. So it's built off the force org create command, which was built initially for Scratch orgs. And we've extended it so that you can now create sandboxes with an additional parameter called -t, which is the type of org. And you can give it some name. So I'm going to say demo2, and then a license type. In this case, I'll say developer. And I'll give it some wait time. It's a traditional developer sandbox, so it will take a few minutes or tens of minutes. And so I'm going to just let this execute. And it needs something that I'm missing out here. Anyways, there's a flag that I'm missing that needs to be set here. Now, the other thing, as I mentioned, I have set up here is I've already authenticated my sandbox org that I previously built into the VS Code editor. How do I know that? I can see this little org picker at the bottom here. This org picker shows all the different orgs that you have authenticated into using VS Code. So once you authenticate, you don't have to remember it anymore. They all show up in the list. You have aliases to quickly determine which org you're working against. You can have production orgs. You can have sandbox orgs. So if you're working on multiple projects, you can switch back and forth between these environments. I happen to have created and authenticated into the sandbox org, and that's the default for my current project. The other thing, I mentioned the word project. You might wonder, what is that? A project in Salesforce parlance is a scaffolding that we have built of all the directories and files that you need, which will work really well with our source tracking capabilities. So this file structure that was created, that you see on the left-hand side, was not built by me by hand. It was scaffolded for me when I created a new project. Again, you could have done this using the command palette or the CLI. The end result is the same. Another cool feature that we added in the last few months is something called the org browser. The org browser works against the default sandbox, and it's a way to remotely view all the metadata that is within your sandbox org. So I can look at the Apex classes that I have within my sandbox, some of the custom objects, and you can see this little cloud icon, which would help pull those changes down to your file system. So if you're getting started with the project for the first time, you authenticate into your sandbox, look at all the sandbox, look at all the files that you care about, pull those files down, and now you have them on your workstation. Now, I happen to have pulled some of these files already, so I will show you the classes and the objects. Notice how there is a format that's being enforced here. You'll see that there is a fields directory under object, and this is part of the new source format that we introduced a couple of years ago. Our objective with that format was so that things are broken down and decomposed into more granular things. It's better for visibility and tracking on your end, but more than that, it also helps us perform our API operations much faster and efficiently because we can do it on smaller payloads. So this fields file, now the field that I have on this custom object shows up as its own file rather than the giant XML that used to exist prior to this. Again, there's a myth that source format is only to be used with Scratch orgs, and that's not true. You can use source format with sandboxes, and we almost encourage you to start moving your source from the metadata to the source format. There's a simple command that lets you translate all of your source, and it's a one-time operation. So once you have converted into source format, you can stick to it and keep using it with all the commands that we have. All right, the other thing I mentioned was source tracking. So let's take a look at it in action. What I'm going to do here is going to quickly check to see if there's any diffs that I created previously. OK, so I am going to quickly push some changes here. And in the meantime, I'm going to open up my org UI. In my production org, I'm going to first log into the sandbox org. I'm going to make a change within my sandbox, show you that we have been able to detect that change between the sandbox and the workstation, pull that change down, then make some more changes locally, and then push that change back into the sandbox. And we'll try doing this using the CLI for now. So once I'm in my sandbox, let's go to the object manager. Go to the object that I care about right now, demo, and a field that I've created previously. Now, the field is marked as non-required, but I need to make a change as part of an application, and I'm going to change it to required. Now, once I've made this change, hopefully, the VS Code editor is able to detect this as a diff. So a command called forSource status will show that the file has changed in my remote environment. In this case, it's saying remote changed, custom field, start time _ C, and an additional file around profiles that is also changed at the same time. I'm going to execute the forSource pull command, and notice how this deploy or this retrieval does not need a package XML. You no longer have to try to track what has changed. We're keeping a sort of a tracker behind the scenes that's helping us pull and detect exactly what has changed within the org. So a very quick operation because it happened exactly on one file. In Winter 20, we introduced this new optimizations on the back end, which you may not even realize, or you may or may not realize, but all small operations now happen on a real-time basis. So we don't queue those operations anymore. They happen synchronously. So all of those smaller operations will happen much faster than previously. And so this was an optimization that we added, I think, last month. All right, so I pulled the change down. My editor is telling me this is a new change. I see the field is required. I obviously have to update my test. My test is not in using the new field. So I'm going to start updating my test, start time _ C. And notice how VS Code is suggesting what I should type next. This type ahead is, again, rich, and it has been brought for Sockle as well as Apex, so code completion is now much easier, and you just get an overall better developer experience, one that you may have used in other IDEs, but something that was lacking in VS Code over the last couple of years. And so I should be able to select some function here, just update this class. And again, if I was to check out what the change is, at this point, it should only show the local file that's changed, because there was only one file that I touched. Now, I pulled the change previously because I was trying to get it down from the org to my local workstation. I have to do just the exact opposite. I'm trying to now push this change. So I'm going to do a source push, and this should push that one particular file. Again, this was a feature that was requested to us by users of Scratch orgs. And they were using this one particular feature as a means to move to Scratch orgs rather than continue using Sandboxes. And as we mentioned earlier, both those models where you are doing org development or package development are equally valid. Both environments, dev sandboxes and Scratch orgs, are valid and and there are the tools for those two methods. And we want you to keep using those tools. So we are trying to add all of this functionality that has been missing in the other type of environment. All right. Now comes the fun part around VCS. Salesforce recommends that you put all your source code into VCS. VCS stands for Version Control System, for those who don't know. Now, VCSs are an imperative for large teams. If you have a lot of developers who are working in parallel, there does come a need for you to fork your code base or merge your changes at some point. VCSs also help you track and version changes to your files over time. But I think the biggest benefit to VCS is truly in automation. Businesses demand today that you rapidly innovate. And that means that your IT teams have to work faster, your developers have to deploy and release changes much faster, and the likelihood of a bug creeping in, because you're making so many changes all the time, is very high. The only way to get around that is to automate parts of your application lifecycle. And that's where CI and CD tools play a big role. CI and CD stands for continuous integration, continuous delivery, and Salesforce tools are meant to work with all of these CI, CD tooling vendors that exist in our ecosystem. Salesforce plays nicely with all of them. In fact, we also have tutorials and sample repos on how to work with each of the CI and CD vendor out there. So I'm going to show you a demo with Travis CI. Notice how the sample repo will direct you to some sort of boilerplate code or configuration that you can quickly and easily adapt to your own needs. There is a Travis YAML file, and for those who don't know how this works, YAML is a format of code that lets you configure a CI system. And what Salesforce has provided is all the boilerplate stuff, which is how do you get set up with the CI? Like, how do you install the CLI within this virtual machine that's going to be spun off and it's going to run your tests? And then there's a section below where you get to configure exactly what you need to run within your CI environment, your CI job. That's sort of the guts of that execution. This is where you can choose to run tests. You can do a deploy only or check only deploy, for example. You can create environments. You can do all of that. So I have, in my example here, borrowed that XML file, or sorry, the YAML file, and I'm doing a couple of operations. I'm first going to authenticate into a Sandbox org that I have set up with the use of a connected app. Previously, a connected app was the only way to headlessly authenticate into a Sandbox. With the CLI changes that I mentioned that we've introduced in summer 19, we've done a bit of magic behind the scenes where as you create the Sandbox, we also authenticate you into the Sandbox without the need for an additional connected app. So your CI and CD can run in a much more seamless way than you have in the past. You shouldn't have to log into the Sandbox, for example, before you can authenticate headlessly. And that means that within every CI, you can create a new Sandbox, or you can clone a Sandbox, run your tests, and then delete the Sandboxes. Something like the Lightning Dev Sandbox is the great use and a great tool for your CI and CD. They are created faster. We've also removed the refresh intervals, so you can delete those Lightning Sandboxes as soon as they're created. So you can recycle those environments several times in a day without having to wait for an additional day. So some of the capabilities that we've added that came from your direct feedback, we have started incorporating in Lightning Sandboxes.
Hey, Rohit, can I script all this?
Yes, you can absolutely script all this.
Just wanted to make sure I wasn't lying to all these people.
So let's look at the changes. I've touched two files. I've happened to set up VCS and version tracking. I've updated two files, so I'm just going to commit these two changes. And I'm going to push this to my remote VCS, which is a GitHub account. In just a few minutes, you'll notice that the Travis CI UI will refresh, and it will kick off that CI build. And as soon as it kicks off, it takes a few minutes. It's usually just polling the GitHub directory, and you can set it up to be the way you want it. You can either kick off CI on a scheduled basis. You can kick off CI as part of every check-in. You can kick it off as part of a merge request. But you get the peace of mind at the end of this that all your tests work and pass, and then the changes that you're about to deploy to production actually work without introducing new bugs. So that was a quick sneak peek at all our tooling in demo. I want to quickly cover your adoption path. And let me see what this is. All right, so we spoke about a lot of new ALM capabilities. We showed you VScode editor. We showed you the new source format, the CLI, new sandboxes, and also this whole notion of externalized source of truth and a VCS. You might be feeling a bit overwhelmed at this because you're used to some development workflow, and it might look quite different from what I just showed you. But there is a path of adoption. I think the quickest way to get started is to start trying out our tooling, which is the Salesforce CLI and the VScode extension. It is the lowest hanging fruit that you can start approaching our new tooling with. All you have to do is replace your IDE. If you're using the Eclipse plugin or you're using some other IDE, you should be able to quickly switch to VScode without any other changes to your development workflow. So you can keep refreshing your sandboxes. You can keep using your source of truth as an org, and it should be a very small change to use the new editor. The same goes with the CLI. If you feel comfortable executing some commands or you want to start scripting things, start getting used to the CLI. Then start externalizing your source. As I mentioned, there's a single command that lets you pull down all your source into your local workstation, and that should be a one-time operation to get all of that source out of an org and into some GitHub or some version control system of your choice. You should be also able to translate all of that code from metadata format into the new source format. Again, this is a one-time operation that puts you on the path to success and to adopting our other tooling that's coming down the line. You can then start automating key processes. As soon as you have things in a VCS, you can start looking at using a CI and CD tool. And we have a lot of steps to help you get started with that approach. We also have trailhead modules that walk you step by step on adopting that tooling. And then finally, you can start looking at modularizing your projects. As I mentioned, there is another form of development, which is the package-based development. And we think that there are some advantages, especially with large teams and large projects, to use package development. And so once you start modularizing and you have all of this base set up, you can start considering package development. And that should give you another level of productivity than what you have today. From a roadmap point of view, just a little bit of updates on what we are going to introduce for the various tooling over the next few releases. The Salesforce CLI is going to have some command auto-completion that gets released in the next month or so. I showed you the org browser, the org picker. There's also a deploy on save functionality, which is really, really cool. Basically, VS Code is polling to see what has changed within your code editor and deploys as soon as you save a file. So it tightens that feedback loop of having to make a change and deploying every single time to an org. We also spoke about the Lightning full sandboxes and source tracking. In the future, we are working on some routing enhancements so that you see better performance from your deploy and retrieve operations. We're trying to find the best instance within Salesforce for your org's needs. So we are able to profile how the different sandboxes look and what size they are, and then find and locate that org on the right instance. We are also working on some release management tooling in summer 20. And again, this is forward-looking stuff. You should check out our other sessions to get a sense of what is going to be what's going to be made available. There are some enhancements to our declarative users that might excite some of you that will be spoken at some of our sessions. So speaking of sessions, let me point you to what's coming next and what you should try to make some time for. The 3 o'clock session today around release management patterns will go over some of your fundamental questions around when to use org development, when to use package development, and what tooling is meant for each of those two types of development. We'll give you a nice cheat sheet that you can take back to your work, and you can print it out and then use it as you're navigating around all of this tooling.
I highly recommend that session. And it's so popular, we're doing it again on Friday as well. So if you can't make it today, I know it's short notice, that it does repeat.
We will have another one is Thursday, 1 o'clock on open conversation about DX. If there is some long-standing bug or some part of your workflow that's not been working well, please come there and voice your opinion. A bunch of different product managers, including some execs, will be available at that session, and we'll try to put that in, to take your feedback during that session, add it to our roadmaps. There was a session yesterday around the data masking product that Raj talked about. If you missed that one, there's another one at 4 o'clock on Thursday that I'll be doing, and we'll show you in action how data masking works, and we'll show you the result of data masking. Again, I know I saw a lot of hands go up when we asked who has a need to obfuscate sensitive data. Please do come to that session. I think you'll find it useful. With that, let me leave you with a few Trailhead modules. You may or may not have seen this in the past, but there are some modules on chain set development, which is for our declarative users, org development, which is same workflow, but more programmatically oriented for those who are comfortable with touching the source code directly, as well as application lifecycle model, which just show you the entire end-to-end process and also provide you some links to CI and CD tools. With that, I thank you for coming here today. I know we are short on time, so I'm going to start taking questions either towards at the end of the room or just outside the room. But thank you.
Thank you.